Hi, welcome to Can You Say That? I'm Jeff Dixon. We're having a conversation. Now, really, it's not a conversation. You're just listening to me talk. So it's a one-way conversation. Hopefully, you're thinking some things, though, as you hear it, about freedom of speech. A lot of times, freedom of speech issues end up in courts somewhere. At least they do in our culture today. And they end up at the Supreme Court sometimes. And so sometimes in the midst of trying to understand what a court is supposed to do, we forget what the role of the Supreme Court is. The Supreme Court interprets the Constitution. That's their job. And so it interprets the Constitution in ways that give people new rights, and it will also impact the rights that they thought they had. For example, the Constitution doesn't say that making threats isn't free speech, but the Supreme Court decided that that was a reasonable limit. Okay? So when you go back and read the Constitution, and we read that earlier on, it didn't talk anything about that. But the Supreme Court has come along and saying, okay, if you make a threat, that's a reasonable limit. So they have interpreted the Constitution, and that has become law. And that's a good thing. That's the way America is set up. That's the way America is supposed to operate. Being able to interpret the Constitution makes the Supreme Court extremely powerful. And that is why so often in the news you hear about the Supreme Court and the decisions they're making. It's interesting that when the Supreme Court makes a decision that you like, everyone's for the Supreme Court. When they make a decision that you don't like, everyone wants to change the court or blow up the court or add judges. And that's just a telltale sign of the immaturity that we have as people when it comes to understanding the freedom. See, that's why this moment is so important, because trying to understand that freedom and deal with it responsibly, because it does carry great responsibility, means that it's really not for people who aren't willing to embrace that. And sadly, in our culture, we have a lot of people who aren't willing to embrace and take the responsibility of freedom. They want it their way or the highway. Sadly, that also comes from some of our politicians. We live in a day and age where we don't have statesmen, it doesn't seem anymore. We have politicians who really like to hold on to power. And they like to have power, and they like to have money. And that is an interesting phenomenon, because that always then forgets about one thing: the people that they were elected to represent. That's not this particular series, but that's very real, and it goes on in our world all the time. And there is a lot of the issues that have to do with free speech that stem from that. But the Supreme Court becomes a very important part of our government then. And so the number of judges, the belief system of those judges, who appoints those judges, all of that is a part of this unique balance of the American experiment. All of that is a part of this journey that America is on. And all of that is a part of understanding how you apply what we have in the First Amendment in the way that you're allowed to flesh it out in the world today. So that means if you have political leanings, or you lean to the left, or you lean to the right, or you lean down the middle, you ought to care about the judges that are there, because those judges do impact what we say and how it's interpreted in the culture. That's a good thing, by the way. I know that our initial reaction is a bad thing when things aren't going the way we want it to. But it is a good thing. There's a check and balance system when the government works right and all of those branches do their job. Because that then puts power back in the hands of the people who vote and elect these officials. That's why it matters when you vote. It matters how you vote. It matters who you vote for. And it matters that you understand what it is that you're voting on. Because the Supreme Court has heard a number of issues that have to do with free speech. For example, in 1919, we mentioned this in another episode. Supreme Court ruled that you can't yell something like fire in a crowded restaurant because it puts people at risk. That actually went all the way to the Supreme Court. That decision was made, and so there was a parameter, a boundary, if you will, put on free speech. In 1969, ruled that kids have the right to free speech in public schools. And so that means that kids in a school have the opportunity to be able to have free speech and exercise that free speech in the proper arenas in a school environment. Does it mean that they can blurt out in class and take over a class? No, that's not what it means. But it does mean that there's a freedom of speech on a campus, and that freedom is allowed by the Constitution, and those students have the right to assemble and express themselves. Now again, does the school have the responsibility of creating a safe environment? Yes. But the Supreme Court is the one that put that parameter in place, and so there's a Supreme Court ruling that impacts that. The Supreme Court also in 1971 ruled that even offensive words are protected by the First Amendment. And so what that means is that you might say something or use some language that I might find wildly offensive. But the fact that I'm offensive doesn't mean that you can't say it. You have the freedom to say it. I have the freedom to become offended by it. And what offends one might not offend another. And there are some words that are more offensive than others. There's no doubt about it. But yet, according to the Supreme Court, free speech allows you to use offensive words. Are they always appropriate? No. Are there some that are very inappropriate? Yes. Are there some that will get you in trouble if you say them at the wrong time? If you use an inappropriate word at an inappropriate moment, will it get you in trouble? There will be consequences. We've talked about that. That's the responsibility of free speech. And common sense keeps you in a good place where you don't get out of line. However, common sense isn't so common, is it? And people will blurt out things all the time. Parents have often had to put their hands over the ears of their kids when someone was using inappropriate language. That's why films, which are allowed to say anything and about everything on film, then will find themselves with ratings. That allows a parent or a caretaker to know that the language or the violence or the sexuality or some of the graphic images in the film may not be appropriate for younger viewers. Or, we never think about this, they may not be appropriate for you and I to see either. But we have to make that decision. What are we going to listen to? Is there freedom to say it? Yes. Do we have the freedom to say, I'm not going to listen? Yes. That's the beauty of it. No one can force you to listen to it. And if they do, then they have violated your rights as well. The Supreme Court also ruled in 1976 that kids have the right to read any book from a library. So, what does that mean? Well, the ripple effect of that is then there needs to be a little bit of a safeguard on what might be placed in a school library, or what section in a public library might someone go to, or what might be allowed in a public library since kids have the opportunity to go to that library. For example, if you go to a public city library, because kids have the right by the Supreme Court to check out anything that's in that library, there may be some branding that needs to be done in the books on what is age appropriate. Hopefully you don't go to your local public library and find pornography there. Hopefully that doesn't happen. It should never happen in a school library. Again, the setting matters, but the rights that the kids have to read the books is important. Are the books allowed to be there? You know, of course. And what books should be there? Now that becomes a decision where you have to look very carefully and closely at what's there. And you don't just get to pick and choose what you like or what you don't like. It always comes down to what is appropriate for the age group that will be looking at it and will have access to it. That's what the Supreme Court ruled on. And so even in our culture sometimes we hear the limits of that being shifted and pushed around just a little bit. In 1977, it ruled that people can't be forced to say things they disagree with, because the freedom of speech you have also guarantees you the freedom not to have to say something. So if you say to me, Jeff, look, here's the deal. You have to say the sky is orange, but I don't want to say the sky is orange. You can't force me to do that. I still have the right to say the sky is blue. That may cause you to be very upset. That may cause you to disagree with me. That may cause you to want to hurt me, but you can't hurt me. And you can't act out physical violence just because my free speech didn't align with what you wanted. Freedom, as we said earlier, is tough. And freedom gets messy. But that's the way freedom has to be. Because when we live in a world where we have those kind of rights, to flesh them out takes a very unique group of people who are able to take freedom for what it is and hold on to it and value it for what it really is, and respect the freedom that others have. sometimes in our culture we seem to be shifting away from that. And one of the reasons is because we don't value it enough. And then we also don't have the responsibility to take care and manage our freedoms wisely. And so we'll continue on in our limited series. Can you say that? Next time.